Bergmann explains that faith is a gift given and not a well-founded argument. Quote, faith is a basic, primary fact of man. Just as I eat and drink, so do I believe. Unquote. Bergmann agreed with Buber that for the religious believer, the importance of faith is not certainty of the objective factual claim on which it rests, that is, a truth claim regarding the very existence of God in some hidden metaphysical space. The certainty required of the religious person lies in a completely different arena, one that is both subjective and existential. Referring to the theological challenge of the Holocaust as a crisis of faith, Bergmann writes, quote, faith is not a theory, it is certainty despite all, it is trust. In other words, Bergmann fully embraces Buber's famous claim that the requisite religious belief is not belief that any particular claim is true, but rather belief in someone. Certainty of faith is a subjective existential state of mind. Against this background, I would like to present and reflect upon the significance of a particularly interesting statement of Bergmann regarding religious belief. In his speech to a meeting of Israeli educators, which took place in the mid-50s, to discuss transmission of Jewish values to Israeli school children, Bergmann demanded that people free themselves from the rule of scientific facts by limiting their boundaries to the realm of the physical. He called upon his audience to, quote, dare to grasp the reality of the transcendent world. A leap beyond neutral science is required. We need to make that leap, end quote. This statement is already a bit unusual due to Bergmann's use of the loaded term leap, which refers not only to a conscious decision to arbitrarily choose between two live options, it also involves acknowledging diametric opposition between the demands of ordinary scientific and logical cognition, meaning the exclusive dominion of facts, and the noble justification for religious belief. But the main innovation in this particular speech to Israeli educators comes when Bergmann chooses to base the leap of faith on a utilitarian consideration, namely the contribution of religious faith in addressing man's existential need for an anchor and compass in life. Quote, humanity is anxious and has no answer to this terrible dread. So faith comes and flings man a rope, which he can hold onto. We cannot find this orientation toward the values of Judaism if we do not succeed in freeing ourselves from the dominion of what we call facts, if we do not dare to grasp the reality of a transcendent world, unquote. Is this really the source of Bergmann's religious belief? Is indeed merely the usefulness of the notion of God to humanity that blocks Bergmann's intellectual skepticism and lets him to believe? When Bergmann speaks of an existential leap of faith, it does not mean to imply that his personal belief in the existence of God rests solely on consideration of psychological benefit, as if it does not sincerely and wholeheartedly believe in the ontological reality of an actual divine presence. His claim is different, that only the act of leaping over the skepticism of scientific method allows one to experience empiric certainty. Only after performing such a leap and truly freeing ourselves from the reign of scientific facts beyond the realms of the physical is it possible to indeed sense the certainty of a transcendent God on an experiential level. Otherwise, we will simply not be able to experience this presence for ourselves, dismissing it as merely an illusion. Only a leap of faith can reveal an empirical experiential dimension that is close to us if we do not open ourselves out to its possibility. When Felix Welch asked Bergmann for the source of his faith, Bergmann replied that it was indeed a leap of self-repudiation, for, quote, every belief is a repudiation, quote. But this leap is clearly not an arbitrary decision to believe, but quite the opposite. From the moment that my ego consents to withdraw from its positions, the space previously concealed by science and reason is vacated, and then the God standing before me simply imposes upon me the certainty of his presence. After one performs the actual leap or has already experienced for herself the direct presence of God before her, the justification for faith is already much stronger. It is an empirical reinforcement of one who has experienced and found the transcendent in practical biblical terms of taste and see. God has indeed revealed to me, present before me, thanks to my having entered into direct dialogue with him. It is thus bona fide, albeit private, certainty, because only I personally have experienced it subjectively in the flesh. Therefore, I will not be able to prove this certainty to others. We must therefore understand that Bergmann's use of leap of faith terminology and the appeal to considerations of existential spiritual gain are employed only as a means of persuading others to take the leap, especially those who thus far have not merited the direct experience of faith. But Bergmann himself no longer needed utilitarian persuasion or decision born of the leap, for he directly felt the metaphysical presence facing him as a truly primal experience, a basic feature of his existence. Kierkegaard, who was famous for presenting faith first as a decisive act of leaping and only then as a completely certain empirical fact, was more radical than Bergmann about the strength of certainty that the believer acquires after his leap of faith. Therefore, Kierkegaard mocked Anselm of Cambrai, who beseeched God in prayer to provide him with conclusive proof of its existence. After all, Kierkegaard argued, if you have already made the leap of faith, you no longer require rational proof. You are already a complete believer because you have acquired a different type of certainty, one that does not stand from reason. In contrast, Bergmann, who speaks of the certainty of his faith, nevertheless admits that even after a believer has experienced the presence of God in the flesh, there are more than a few moments in which he feels the need for philosophical proof, and in those moments he does lack certainty. It is here precisely that Bergmann finds use for Buber's dialogic view as contrast to Kierkegaard's conception of religious belief. Bergmann explains it this way. Although while experiencing the presence of God before me, I harbor no doubt in my heart regarding his existence. Buber has taught us that the I-thou experience is not exclusive in our lives and is frequently replaced by the I-it situations. Therefore, when a person does not currently experience God's immediate presence before him, even though he did experience it only a moment before, he is now in a situation which nevertheless requires intellectual argument in order to establish belief in the certainty of God's existence. When a person is required to base his faith on arguments beyond the subjective dimension, that is to rely on rational argument, individual private experience no longer serves as an objective factor on which theoretical propositions can be based. This view of Bergmann's was evidenced on another occasion in which he was asked that what his personal faith was based upon. Here, he replied that it was his existential certainty, though he could not explain its origin. It seems to me that Bergmann is less emphatic than Rosenzweig regarding his ability to justify his certainty of faith. Rosenzweig seems to claim that this experience of certainty can be transmitted and justified to others as well, as long as they have a healthy mind and do not suffer the mental illness typifying philosophers. But Bergmann testifies that even after experiencing in the flesh direct confrontation with God's metaphysical presence, he nevertheless still sometimes lapses into rational I-it state of mind, and then even the memory of direct experience does not absolve him of the scientist's skepticism, wondering if this was a true experience or just an illusion. It is possible, therefore, that Bergmann's remarks regarding the virtue of exercising utilitarian considerations, such as the need for a moral compass or existential anchor in life as basis for leaps of religious faith, were also intended for himself. After all, Bergmann was well aware that after Kant, St. Anselm's prayer for logical proof for God's existence would no longer be answered. All that remained for Bergmann in such moments of skepticism was to appeal to considerations of existential or moral benefit, so that he might once again experience an I-Thou connection with a direct metaphysical presence. I will now move on to Bergmann's use of the leap of faith idea regarding other scriptural claims beyond basic belief in the very existence of a metaphysical God. Here too, when dealing with the contemporary relevance of biblical texts as a primary basis for modern revival of faith, Bergmann followed the footsteps of his masters, Buber and Rosenzweig. The Bible should be read and internalized by the modern Jew without any symptoms of modern rational skepticism regarding the reliability of the revelation described within. In other words, the religious benefit that the Bible can give us is conditional on suspension of doubt and acceptance of simple, unsophisticated faith in the biblical claim as it stands. In the same speech to Israeli educators, Bergmann repeats and accepts Rosenzweig's famous remarks regarding his belief in the biblical story of Balaam's donkey that opens her mouth and speaks. Outside the synagogue, it is clear to Rosenzweig that it is only a myth, but not so while he is in synagogue and following the ceremonial reading of the Torah. From this, we learn that Bergmann as well is not committed to the objective truth of various biblical claims or to the biblical stories in all their details. Biblical practices are important because they establish within us the required subjective experience of belief, but not necessarily because they are precise truth. However, despite the fact that Bergmann cites Rosenzweig's remarks regarding Balaam's donkey as an example of the general type of leap of faith that is required in order to feel the presence of a metaphysical dimension, we must still distinguish between the intensity of Bergmann's belief in the very existence of God and our ability to stand before him in a mutual relationship that is a form of revelation, and his far more arbitrary belief in the correctness of the other more specific and detailed claims of biblical stories. It is clear to any reader of Bergmann that his demand that we speak of the actual presence and existence of God is not mere talk on his part. It is a meaningful and critical requisite as far as is concerned. Bergmann does not attach too much importance to the question of the objective truth of specific biblical stories, because the critical point for him is the overall truth of the Bible, that there is a transcendent God and an actual possibility of real dialogue between man and God. That's when Bergmann evades confirmation of the historical truth of various miracles that appear in the Bible. He poses against these the total miracle in which he believes wholeheartedly. The gaze of the believer sees all as one complete and gigantic miracle. The influence of Buber and Rosenzweig on Bergmann is most evident in Bergmann's repetition of the existential assertion that the main, if not exclusive, importance of the Torah for us is this, that all the Torah from A to Z, from Aleph to Tav, comes to declare that revelation and direct confrontation between man and God, according to Buber, or between the Jewish people and God, on Bergmann's formulation, is indeed possible and did indeed occur. Bergmann also argued that the purpose of divine revelation is not in order to convey any further truth claims of, or third-party information beyond the very presence of God before us. Therefore, Bergmann did not attach paramount religious importance to the factual accuracy of remaining biblical claims or of any other specific events to which it refers, beyond the very encounter with God. The revelation at Sinai is indeed the focal point of the Bible's importance, and Bergmann presents his belief in this revelation as a complete certainty, affirming that it was indeed a historical event experienced by its participants firsthand as a direct empirical experience. But such empiric certainty grabs only those who experience the event firsthand. Jews of future generation receive the revelation only through tradition rather than direct personal experience. Therefore, Bergmann can't present his own personal belief in the historicity of revelation as a proven empirical certainty that bears, even in his own eyes, some scientific validity. Bergmann chooses not to question various biblical accounts of concrete revelatory experiences, and hence his personal conviction regarding the facticity of the revelation at Sinai on a faith that has no solid logical foundation, rather than on experiential evidence that can be transmitted to non-believers and pursued them. Bergmann took upon himself a leap of faith in the principles of the Jewish religion, but refused to continue with tradition's claim regarding the uniqueness or superiority of Judaism over other religions. Its absolute certainty lies in its very confrontation with God's presence, but his personal leap of faith, which led him to the specific framework of Judaism, does not rest upon claims regarding the superiority of one religion over others. The degree of truth is willing to attribute to the specific claims of its religion, meaning Judaism, is something that Bergmann formulates in a completely different way. In fact, all religions are true, and the various revelations to which they attest have indeed occurred. They all testify to empiric revelations of a transcendent God, but these God's genuine manifestations differ from each other in accordance with the changing nature of the various target audiences. Therefore, Bergmann concludes, every religion is but a partial human aspect of the one common truth, which is represented in all religions as a whole. For Bergmann, overall objective truth is capable of containing different partial perspectives and truth claims. It seems to me that this ecumenical pluralism of Bergmann also demonstrates the limits of his claim regarding characteristics of the metaphysical God's certain existence, since there is no agreement between the various religions as to the nature of God, or even as to whether he is one God or many. It seems indeed that Bergmann's pluralistic claims regarding ecumenism, for example, apply to pagan religions as well. The absolute empiric certainty that Bergmann attached to his leap of faith is thus limited only to the very existence of an actual transcendent presence. Bergmann is not committed to nailing down further details regarding the character and nature of a metaphysical deity. Bergmann's leap of faith specifically to Judaism and not to rival religions is presented even by Bergmann himself as a decision of faith and not as a proof of the superiority of Jewish truth claims over those of competing religions. Bergmann touches here upon another feature of the leap of faith. According to him, the confusion of tragic contradictions faced by all of mankind and the abyss we experience between ourselves and the world is resolved by the religious attempt to leap over this abyss to that comprehensive metaphysical one, which transcends all contradictions between disparate parts and differing doctrines. In this sense, it is precisely the Jewish truth shared by other monotheistic religions that allows for a harmonious solution to the frontal contradictions between all possible religions. Therefore, from the heights of holistic monotheistic metaphysics, the truth of the revelation of all conflicting religions can be validated, because all of them together play their part in expressing the supreme, all-inclusive metaphysical truth. Bergmann does not relate belief in the metaphysical to a conflict with science, and does not attempt to fortify the validity of religious belief on the ruins and dismissal of scientific certainty. On the contrary, logical method and experimental science are important and necessary despite their limitations, but beyond their bounds there is an external space in which science has nothing to offer, and it is precisely in this expanse that faith resides, so that one could say that it is precisely science, when perceived correctly, and acknowledging the circumscribed limits of its dominion, which enables and points to the legitimate and desirable metaphysical realm of faith. Bergmann likens the order of things, in which faith appears first and reason follows only later, to the difference between the raw material for waving, which is a primary given, and the subsequent after waving, whose raw material is already given. In conclusion, Hugo Bergmann's theological and Jewish thought must be understood against the background of the innovation and emphasis of his masters, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, whether with regard to the crucial issue of the very characterization of faith, or to the need for basing its certainty on the experience of existential presence, or to the importance of detaching it in principle from logical discursive proofs, in all these features there is much agreement between the three thinkers. The same is true of Buber's famous statement that Jewish faith requires of us an existential state of personal trusting relations with God, and not necessarily conviction that is intellectually validated by the theoretical correctness of a belief that so and so is true. Despite this stance, Rosenzweig and Bergmann explicitly claim that they attach total certainty to the truth of their belief. The leap of decision is nothing other than removal of the problematic assumption that grants exclusivity to scientific intellectual space. Once one recognizes the limits of this space, the experience of direct presence of a metaphysical God appears. This is how the special terminology of leap of faith can be applied to these three thinkers. As we have seen, theological consensus is also evident in the way that Bergmann repeated Buber and Rosenzweig claims regarding the correct reading of scriptural claims. He too called for a kind of second innocence, but harnessed it to the main purpose of existential encounter with the Bible as a platform for experiencing the true presence of the God standing before us, and not specially for the theoretical and historical validation of true faith in various miracles or other specific events described in Scripture. The three thinkers relegated declaration to absolute certainty only to the biblical account of Revelation itself, or to the relationship of direct presence between man and God. Other dogmatic claims of one religion or another require leaps of another sort, and do not necessarily negate the truth of parallel revelations in other religions, since human beings are not capable of transposing one revelatory experience or another from its subjective setting to a shared objective dimension. But, despite the above common ground, there are nevertheless some important nuances that differentiate between these thinkers, and I have tried to highlight them here. Regarding Bergmann's explicit remarks about the leap of faith, one can still understand in terms of Buber's and Rosenzweig's readiness to recognize the limits of reason and science, so that faith can arrive on its own, not by means of an absurd leap, but by providing us with the opportunity to truly experience a metaphysical presence. As against this, I presented Bergmann's utilitarian justification for belief, meaning the psychological and existential need for an anchor and moral compass in life, as a notable exception to Buber and Rosenzweig's legacy. I also suggested that Bergmann intended his utilitarian consideration simply as a secondary basis for leaps of faith, which is designed both to pursue others who have not yet taken the leap and to convince himself personally only during fleeting moments of smallness of spirit, in those situations where he does not feel God standing before him. Only then does Bergmann allow himself to appeal to considerations of existential benefit. Thanks.